New York City, winter 1951. Third floor of a building on West 44th Street. The radiator in the corner has been ticking for an hour, and no one has thought to adjust it. There are folding chairs along the wall, 7 of them occupied, 2 empty, and the particular kind of silence that only exists in rooms where people are waiting to be judged. A casting director stands near the window with a clipboard and a cigarette. He has done this 1,000 times. He knows within 30 seconds of looking at a person whether they are what he needs. It is not cruelty. It is efficiency. The industry taught him that, and he was an excellent student. He glances toward the back of the room. There is a young man sitting there, quiet, still, watching nothing in particular. He doesn't have the posture of someone performing readiness. He simply exists in the chair, completely present and somehow completely apart. The casting director looks at him for a moment. Then he makes a small notation on his clipboard and says it, not unkindly, but without hesitation. "Too soft for this role, next." The young man looks up. He nods once. He gathers his jacket from the back of the chair, walks to the door and leaves without a word. He books the role within the week. Not because he argued, not because he complained to the right people or performed a different version of himself, but because of what he did in the days between that dismissal and the moment he walked back into a room and made the word soft feel like entirely the wrong word. That young man was James Dean. And what he did next, quietly, methodically, without anyone watching, is the part of this story that almost no one has told. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand what New York City meant to a young actor in the early 1950s. This was before Hollywood had fully absorbed the generation that would change it. Broadway was still the proving ground, the place where a performer either became real or didn't. The Actors Studio on West 44th Street was already reshaping what American acting looked like, under the influence of Lee Strasberg, and a method that asked actors not to represent emotion, but to locate it, to reach into their own psychological history and pull something true to the surface. It was rigorous, sometimes brutal, often deeply personal work, and it attracted a particular kind of performer, not the polished, presentable type the studios had spent decades cultivating. Something rawer, something less finished, something that the commercial casting world in 1951 did not entirely know what to do with. James Dean had arrived in New York the previous year. He was 20 years old, recently arrived from Los Angeles, carrying a drama scholarship and a restlessness that had no clean explanation. He was from Fairmount, Indiana, a town of quiet fields and evangelical church-going and very little patience for the kind of interior life that Dean had been building since childhood. He had enrolled at UCLA, then abandoned it. He had drifted. And then he had come east, because something in him understood that east was where the serious work was being done. He lived in a shared apartment, took small television parts, drank diner coffee, and studied with a focus that people around him described as almost frightening in its intensity. He was not famous, he was not yet mythologized. He was simply a young man who knew, with a certainty that occasionally alarmed the people who tried to redirect him, exactly what kind of actor he intended to be. The problem, in the winter of 1951, was that the industry had not yet decided it wanted that kind of actor. And the casting director with the clipboard had just told him so. The production in question was a Broadway mounting, a drama requiring a young male lead of a particular kind. The character needed presence, authority, a certain legibility of emotion that the audience could follow from the back row of the orchestra. The casting director had a clear image in his mind. He knew the shape of the performance he needed. And so the auditions that morning had a kind of choreography to them, actors entering, reading, either fitting the shape or not. Most of them were trying, visibly and earnestly, to fit the shape. Dean was not trying to fit anything. He had arrived early enough to sit in the back, not at the front, where the other actors clustered and spoke loudly about recent credits and mutual acquaintances, performing their own confidence for an invisible audience. He had taken the last chair on the left side of the room, set his jacket across his knees, and sat with the particular stillness of someone who is not waiting so much as observing. He was watching the room, not the casting director, not the other actors. The room itself, the quality of the winter light coming through the grimy window, the way the radiators ticking established an irregular rhythm that no one else seemed to hear, the way the man with the clipboard held his cigarette between his index and middle fingers and only looked at the actors' faces for about 4 seconds before his eyes moved back to the paper. There was another young man across the room who was almost the inverse of Dean in every visible quality. He sat forward. He smiled at the right moments. When the casting director glanced his way, he straightened almost imperceptibly, offering himself organized, available, shaped for this. He was good-looking in the conventional sense that 1951 understood. He had done summer stock. He had a credit in a touring production of something respectable. When his name was called, he stood cleanly, walked to the center of the room, and read with a confidence that the casting director visibly responded to. The clipboard came up. A notation was made, not a dismissal, an acknowledgement. Then Dean's name was called. He stood, he walked to the center, and what happened there was not, by the standards of the room, a failure, but it was not a match. He was too interior, too specific, too located inside something that the other people in the room couldn't quite follow. The casting director watched him for 30 seconds. Then he made his notation. Too soft for this role. Dean nodded. He returned to the back of the room, picked up his jacket and walked to the door. But the woman sitting at the small desk near the entrance, a stage manager named Helen, who had worked these rooms for 11 years, and had a particular eye for the kind of thing that clipboards miss, watched him walk out and noticed something. He didn't look like the others looked when they left after a dismissal. He didn't look wounded or deflated or done. He looked, she would later tell a colleague, like he was already working on something. Like the dismissal had given him a piece of information he intended to use. What do you do when someone with real authority tells you that the truest thing about you is the wrong thing? That the quality you have built your entire interior life around is a liability? Most people in that situation make adjustments. They sand something down. They try to become more of what the room is asking for. James Dean went home and did something else entirely. To understand why that verdict landed the way it did, and why his response to it was so specific, you have to go back further than that casting room. You have to go back to Indiana. Dean's mother, Mildred, died of uterine cancer when he was 9 years old. He had been close to her in the way that children are close to the parent who sees them, really sees them, before the world begins its work of categorizing them into something more manageable. Her death was not something he processed cleanly. How could it be? He was 9. His father, unable to care for him alone, sent him to live with his aunt and uncle in Fairmount. They were good people, loving people, by every account, but the emotional landscape of Fairmount in the 1940s was not one that had much room for a boy who felt everything too visibly, who was moved by things that other boys his age had learned to be indifferent to, who could sit in a field and be genuinely arrested by the quality of the afternoon light. He was sensitive in a way that the culture around him could not fully honor. And so he learned not to suppress it but to protect it, to carry it carefully like something fragile in a rough coat pocket. He found outlets, the church drama group, a theater teacher named Adeline Knoll who recognized what she was looking at and gave it room to grow. But fundamentally, he arrived in New York as someone who had spent his entire childhood being told, in 100 small ways, that his interior life was excessive. That feeling things that deeply was not a strength. The method told him otherwise. Lee Strasberg's approach, and the work Dean was doing at the Actors Studio, was built on exactly the premise that Dean had been quietly defending his entire life. That emotional truth, specifically remembered and precisely deployed, was the highest instrument an actor possessed. That the goal was not to manage feeling but to use it. That sensitivity was not softness in the pejorative sense. It was precision. Dean had found in that methodology a professional language for something he had always known privately. And now a man with a clipboard had walked directly into the center of that and told him it wasn't enough. He went back to his apartment on the Upper West Side. It was a small place, a desk, a narrow bed, a window that looked out over a courtyard where someone's laundry turned slowly in the winter air. He made coffee. He sat at the desk, and he opened the script. Not a different script, the same one he had read in that room 40 minutes earlier. He began working it, not in the way the casting director had wanted, but in the way Dean understood work, from the inside out, finding the character's specific wound, locating the place where that fictional person had been made into who they were, building something so particular, so internally coherent, that an audience would have no choice but to believe it. He wasn't preparing to argue with anyone. He wasn't building a case. He was doing what he always did when the world told him he was wrong about himself. He went deeper. Stay with me here, because what happens next, when Dean finds his way back into that room, and what a director who witnessed it said afterward, is the part of this story that changes the frame on everything that came before it. It was not supposed to happen. There was no formal second audition, no official callback. The production had moved forward in the way productions move forward, other names circled, other decisions made, the machinery of casting grinding along with its usual indifference to the people it had already processed and set aside. But the theater world of early 1950s New York was, for all its apparent size, a remarkably small place. The same corridors, the same coffee counters, the same circle of directors, stage managers and working actors who had seen enough to know the difference between a performer who wanted to be seen and a performer who had something to say. One of those directors was a man who had been present at the edges of that original session, not running it, not holding the clipboard, but observing from a chair near the back wall in the way that certain directors do when they are not yet decided about something. He had watched Dean walk to the center of the room. He had watched the casting director make his notation, and he had watched Dean leave. And something had stayed with him. He had worked in the theater long enough to develop a particular instinct, not for polish, not for the immediately legible kind of talent, but for the rarer thing, the performer who is operating from a place so genuine that the camera or the audience or simply the air in the room around them responds differently. He had seen it perhaps a handful of times in his career. It had a specific quality, a specific temperature. He had felt something like that temperature when Dean stood in the center of that room, and the casting director's notation had struck him, privately, as the kind of mistake that confident people make when they are measuring the wrong thing. He made an inquiry. Through a mutual contact, a fellow actor's studio member who knew Dean from workshop sessions, he arranged a second look. Informal. No clipboard. No folding chairs lined with competing actors. Just a room, a director, and the pages of a script. Dean arrived. The same jacket, the same quality of stillness, but something had been added to it in the days since the dismissal, a specificity, a depth of preparation that you could feel before he opened his mouth. He had been inside this material, not skimming it, not performing familiarity with it, but genuinely living in it. The way you can only live in something when you have stopped trying to make it work and allowed it to work through you instead. The director asked him to begin. He began. The room changed. Not dramatically, not with any of the visible, audible markers of theatrical success, no sharp intake of breath, no sudden forward lean. It was quieter than that and more certain. The quality of the attention in that room shifted. The way attention shifts when something true is happening nearby and your nervous system recognizes it before your conscious mind has caught up. Dean moved through the scene with a precision that had nothing performative about it. He was not showing the character. He was being someone whose wound was so specifically located, so carefully inhabited, that the fictional frame around him became almost irrelevant. You were not watching an actor read sides from a Broadway script. You were watching a person exist in a situation that was costing them something real. At one point, about two-thirds of the way through the scene, he went completely still. Not the stillness of someone who has lost the line. The stillness of someone who has found the center of a moment and is standing inside it, absolutely. The kind of stillness that fills a room the way silence fills a room after a bell has been struck, not as the absence of sound, but as the presence of something that resonates. The director said nothing. Then, very quietly, he set down his own copy of the script. That detail, that small, unhurried gesture, that was the moment. Because in a room where a man with a clipboard had once made a notation that amounted to not enough, a different man, watching the same person do the same fundamental thing, had simply stopped needing to take notes. Dean finished, he looked up. The director looked at him for a long moment and said, not as a compliment, not as industry praise, but as a statement of plain professional fact. That is not softness. That is the most controlled thing I have seen in a room this size. He got the call back. But here is the thing that almost no account of this period of Dean's life fully addresses. He never spoke publicly about that first dismissal, not in the interviews that followed his rise, not in the conversations that his friends and collaborators later reconstructed from memory. He did not carry that casting director's verdict around as a grievance or a story he told to illustrate his own resilience. He simply absorbed it, used it, and moved forward. Because for James Dean, the work was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving something true. This was not an isolated morning in a drafty casting room on West 44th Street. If you trace the arc of Dean's early career, the television work, the stage appearances, the cautious and occasionally skeptical attention of the film industry that would eventually make him permanent, you find the same pattern recurring with a consistency that begins to feel less like coincidence and more like character. He was underestimated, regularly, specifically, by people who were not foolish, who were not operating in bad faith, but who were measuring with instruments calibrated to a world that Dean was already, quietly, in the process of making obsolete. When Elia Kazan was assembling the cast for East of Eden in 1954, the studio was not initially convinced that Dean was the right choice for Cal Trask. The part required a young man capable of carrying a film, of holding the audience's investment across 2 hours of morally complex, emotionally demanding material. There were questions. Was he stable enough? Was he legible enough, that specific word, that recurring concern, for a mainstream audience? Kazan had done his own version of what that director in the small room had done. He had watched Dean work, and what he said afterward in his own notes and in later interviews was something that echoed the same essential observation, that Dean's quality was not the kind of quality you could manufacture through training or discipline alone. It was constitutional. It was who he was before he entered the room and who he remained after he left it. Kazan's screen test for East of Eden, the footage of which exists and has been described by film historians as almost uncomfortable in its authenticity, shows exactly what the casting director with the clipboard had seen and misread. Dean is not performing. He is not indicating emotion for the benefit of the camera. He is present in a way that the camera, far from diminishing, actually intensifies. The lens found in him something that the human eye in a crowded casting room had overlooked. The word soft had been used as a verdict. The camera revealed it as a description of something else entirely, a permeability, a refusal to place protective distance between himself and the material that made everything he did on screen feel like it was happening for the first time, in real time, to a real person. Others who worked alongside him at the actor's studio spoke about this in the years afterward. The actor Martin Landau, who knew Dean during this period, described watching him in workshop with a specific kind of attention. The attention you pay to someone when you sense, before you can fully articulate it, that you are watching something that will matter later. That the work being done in that room, in front of 12 people on a Tuesday afternoon, was work of genuine consequence. And there is one other element of this pattern that deserves to be named directly. Every time Dean was told, explicitly or implicitly, that his particular quality was a problem, he responded not with defensiveness but with depth. He did not argue at the level of the criticism. He answered it at a level the criticism couldn't reach. He went further into the thing they had told him was wrong, rather than retreating from it. And what emerged on the other side was something so fully realized that the original criticism became simply irrelevant. That is not stubbornness. That is a very particular kind of intelligence. Think back to the folding chairs, the radiator ticking in its irregular rhythm, the young man in the back of the room who was watching the quality of the winter light through a grimy window, while everyone else was performing readiness for a man with a clipboard. What looked like distraction was preparation. What looked like softness was precision. What looked like a young man who didn't quite understand the room was, in fact, a young man who understood the room completely, and had already decided that the room's standards were not the standards he intended to meet. He was going to meet his own. And before I tell you what it cost him, and what it ultimately meant, I want to make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because the story we're about to arrive at is the part that the public biography almost never reaches. The part that lives behind the mythology, in the quieter spaces where the real person was always more interesting than the legend. Here is what the mythology gets wrong about James Dean. The mythology says he was tortured. It says he was difficult, combustible, a creature of pure instinct who burned too bright and too fast for a world that couldn't contain him. It says his sensitivity was a kind of self-destruction, a beautiful liability that made him luminous and doomed in equal measure. That version of the story is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. Because the James Dean who sat in that casting room on a winter morning in 1951, the one who absorbed a professional dismissal without argument, went home to a small apartment, made coffee, and opened the script again, that James Dean was not a creature of pure instinct. He was something considerably more disciplined and considerably more deliberate than the legend allows. He never spoke about being told he was too soft. Think about what that means in an industry built on narrative self-presentation, in a culture where the story of your own struggle is currency, where actors and artists have always understood that the right version of their hardship, told to the right journalist at the right moment, is itself a kind of performance that serves the career. Dean was surrounded by people who understood this instinctively, who knew how to position their own difficulties as evidence of their depth, their resilience, their essential seriousness. Dean did not do this. The woman at the front desk of the actor's studio, who had seen hundreds of young performers pass through those doors, who had watched the full spectrum of how ambition and rejection interact in a young person's face, said something about Dean that has stayed, quietly, in the margins of his biography. She said that he was one of the very few she had known who seemed genuinely uninterested in being understood by the people who were judging him, that he wanted to be understood by the work, that the work was the only audience he was consistently playing to. This is not a small distinction. Most people, when they are told that something fundamental about them is wrong, experience it as a verdict about their worth. And so they either internalize it, begin to believe the verdict, begin to sand themselves down toward the shape the world prefers, or they externalize it, wear the dismissal as a badge, build an identity around having been underestimated. Dean did neither. He held the verdict at arm's length, examined it with the same careful attention he brought to a script, extracted from it whatever was genuinely useful, because even a wrong assessment can contain a useful observation if you are honest enough to look, and then he set it down and went back to work. That quality, that specific, disciplined refusal to let the world's judgment become his own interior voice, was not something that came easily to him. People who knew him well during this period speak about a young man who felt things with an intensity that was sometimes almost unbearable, who could be derailed by a careless remark, undone by the particular loneliness of being in a room full of people and feeling entirely alone in it. He was not armored, he was never armored. But he had developed something that functions differently from armor, something closer to a compass. A fixed point inside himself that he returned to when the external noise became too loud. And that fixed point was always the same thing: the work, the truth of the work, the standard he had set for himself in the quiet of his own preparation, before anyone else was watching, before the judgment of the room had become a factor. Elia Kazan, who was not a man given to easy sentiment, said something in his autobiography that has always struck me as the most accurate single sentence ever written about what James Dean actually was. He said that Dean had a quality of, and I am paraphrasing here, absolute emotional availability combined with absolute technical control. That those two things, which most actors can only achieve one at a time, existed in Dean simultaneously. That he could be completely open and completely precise in the same moment. That is what the casting director with the clipboard had seen and called softness. He was looking at the openness. He was not seeing the control. And perhaps that is where this story truly begins, not in the moment of dismissal, but in the long, quiet years of preparation that made Dean's response to that dismissal possible. The drama teacher in Indiana who told him his feelings were instruments, not liabilities. The actor's studio sessions that gave his interior life a professional framework. The small apartment, the desk, the coffee, the script opened again after the room had already closed its door on him. He did not become James Dean, in spite of being told he was too soft. He became James Dean because he already knew, with a certainty that no casting director's clipboard could touch, that softness was not the right word for what he was. Present was the right word. Alive was the right word. And the screen, when he finally stood in front of it, knew the difference immediately. One cold casting room, one winter morning, one man with a clipboard who looked at James Dean and made a notation that amounted to not enough. And one young man who walked out of that room, went home, made coffee, opened the script and began, without argument, without performance, without any audience at all, the work that would eventually make the word enough feel entirely beside the point. He did not prove them wrong by becoming someone else. He proved them wrong by becoming, more completely, himself. That is the part of James Dean that the mythology obscures and the legend flattens. Not the rebel, not the icon, not the beautiful, doomed creature frozen forever at 24, but the young man at the desk in the small apartment, in the winter quiet, doing the work because the work was the only honest answer he knew how to give. There is something in that, something that extends far beyond Hollywood, far beyond the 1950s, far beyond the particular story of one actor in one casting room on one unremarkable Tuesday morning. It is the story of what happens when a person decides that the truest thing about them is worth defending, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, privately, and with the kind of discipline that looks, from the outside, exactly like softness. I want to ask you something genuinely before you go. Have you ever been told that something true about you, something you knew in the quiet of your own honest self-assessment was actually a strength, was the wrong thing, that it made you too much or not enough for the room you were standing in? Leave it in the comments. I read them. And I think this particular story, this specific morning in 1951, this specific young man at this specific desk, is worth sitting with, because it suggests that those moments of dismissal are not always the end of something. Sometimes they are the beginning of the most important work you will ever do. If this kind of storytelling means something to you, the hidden moments, the quiet reversals, the human being behind the legend, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every story we tell here is chosen because it changes something about how you understand the person you thought you already knew. The next story I want to tell you involves a letter James Dean wrote and never sent, and what was found inside the envelope that no one was supposed to open. That story is coming, and it is worth the wait.